Welcome to the 1776 table, Who Shaped American Cuisine, presented by ChefWorks as a LDEI live online event. I'm your host, Sheila Cry. As the United States approaches its 250th anniversary, Americans are reflecting on the people, ideas, and events that shaped our nation. Today, we're taking that conversation to the table. What did people actually eat during the Revolutionary era? Who grew, cooked, sold, traded, and wrote about food? Whose culinary knowledge was celebrated and whose contributions went unrecognized? The story of American cuisine is far more complex and far more diverse than many of us learned in school. Over the next hour, we'll explore early American foodways through archaeology, politics, publishing, and public markets. We'll examine not only what was on the table, but also the people whose hands and knowledge made those meals possible. I'm delighted to be joined by four remarkable scholars, historians, and authors whose work is helping us better understand the many individuals and communities that shaped American food culture. Robin Griffith is a culinary historian whose research combines archaeology, food history, and storytelling to uncover the lives of people often missing from traditional historical narratives. Her work explores how food connects us with place, culture, and community, and particularly among historically marginalized populations. Laura Kumin is a food historian and author whose fascination with Alexander Hamilton led her deep into the dining rooms, kitchens, and social rituals of the founding era. She brings a vivid understanding of how hospitality, entertaining, and food helped shape the relationships and influence in the early republic. Dame Toni Tipton Martin is one of America's most influential culinary historians and authors. Through decades of groundbreaking research, she has expanded our understanding of African American food history and the role of cookbooks as records of culture, creativity, and lived experience. Her work continues to uncover stories that challenge and enrich the historical record. Ashley Rose Young is a food historian and curator of American history at the Library of Congress who studies the networks of people who moved from food from farms and producers to consumers. Through her work with rare books, archives, and public history, she illuminates the markets, vendors, and everyday exchanges that helped build American food traditions. And now, let's shine the spotlight on our moderator, Ashley Rose Young.
Hi, everyone. So excited to be here with you today and to talk about American history through the lens of food. So, I want to kick things off with our fantastic panel here by asking a pretty broad question. And I'd love to hear your kind of rapid fire response. We're going to spend about 5-ish minutes or so talking about this initial question. So, when we think about the American table in 1776, what do most people get wrong? And just chime in, go ahead. Or I'll start calling on people soon enough.
I can start. This is Robin. So I think when we think of, what was on the table, it's really important to know that there were many tables, right? Thousands of tables, because it really depended on where you lived, your circumstances, your culture, and even within those variables, it could change. So, the season, so supply chain. So I think that's really important. It wasn't just one table. There was just a lot going on at that time.
What
I
about
guess I
you,
can
Laura or Tony? Go ahead, Tony. I'd love
I
to hear
can
your
go next
thoughts.
and just say that I think what we often overlook is how the food gets to the table. There's a lot of conversation about food and farming and gardening in modern day as well as then as ways for us to center our culinary history. But we often forget about the people that helped get that food onto the table. And we have a stilted view of what that work involved. We, especially as it relates to the enslaved, we tend to focus primarily on the laborious aspects of getting that food on the table, but we don't often talk about the artistry and celebrate the creativity. And so that's an important aspect for us to have focus on so that we get a fuller story.
And I guess I think about how different it was. One of the things that I'm focused on is like we're we are all about non-alcoholic drinks and water and bubbly water and fruit flavored water and those things did not exist. And the most popular drink in this late 18th century in the 1770s was rum. And they liked fortified wines. I mean, Madeira? Who even drinks Madeira these days? It's just a very different world. And the other thing is, if we think about, you don't give alcohol to children, and there's a particular age that people are always carded in bars. Well, that didn't exist, that system. And even young children drank alcoholic beverages. First of all, they were safer. They were safer than milk and they were safer than water. Anyway,
Um, I am loving these insights already. I can tell we're going to have a fantastic conversation today. So thanks for getting us thinking about what life was like in 1776 and the years before and after that. When I think about American history and the America 250 moment, I am thinking kind of in a much longer time period. But today, we are going to hover around 1776 and a few decades after that, a few decades before. But I might chime in with some late 19th century stuff too. But I want to bring things back to Robin for a moment. And I want to know a little bit more about what archaeological evidence there is that tells us about what Americans actually ate that isn't reflected in the cookbooks and the written records that people like Tony and myself and Laura love to rely on. But what do we learn from archaeology about what people were eating in, 1776-ish?
Ish. Yes, thank you. It's really interesting because it's not just the cookbook, but it's the notes and our great great grandmother, great great aunties, you know, pieces on a piece of paper stuck in something. And so, how do we know that that is what they actually ate? And so, just to back it up a little bit to tell you how I kind of, started this journey about 4 years ago, I connected with an archaeobotanist. At a site in Charleston, South Carolina. It's the Nathaniel Russell House. And she was doing research in the East Chamber, which is the upstairs kitchen utilized only by the enslaved during that time. It's a little bit later, maybe 30 years later than like, the end of the Revolutionary War, but it's still relevant, right? That was just the period of this particular home. And we connected over an okra seed of all things. But really the recipes and the cookbooks tell you what's there and then the archaeology tells you exactly what was used, right? And so my role has been with this team and other archaeologists, botanists around the world, has been taking their botanical findings right? And then bringing it to life and recreating the recipe at the period standard, right? So be it early 1800s, the Revolutionary War, Jamestown. I'm actually working on a project where we found pulse seeds in a cave that were burned, and the cave was inhabited by Neanderthals. And when they did the carbon dating, it was 60 to 80,000 years ago. And a pulse is related to a lentil. So that's going to be fun. That's a side project, right? So, so actually finding what was used for, let me give you an example. George Washington, they just recently in Mount Vernon, they found some cherry pits and there was liquid. So, and everybody's really excited, and it is a wonderful find, but were those cherry pits, once they do the DNA analysis, were those cherry pits something that he grew there? Was it a gift? Was it a graft from someplace around the world? And exactly what did they use, right? What was the true sugar content? What was the molasses content? Because they didn't use table sugar. Everything was, molasses from the islands. Or excuse me, everything was, sugar cane from the islands. Um, and I really think that's it. That's just the beauty of it. And then you get a real true feel for, what was used. True life experience is I started a preserve company, pickles and preserves. And I used my great grandmother's recipe from the late 1800s. And once I got serious about it, it took me about 5 years to figure it out. You know why? Because I couldn't get it to work. And then I found out they used a different varietal in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And that's why I couldn't get it to work, because strawberries are now hybridized to be big and juicy and red. And back then it was more like a wild strawberry. They were small and, not so juicy. You also saw more strawberry pie recipes back in that time period too. So that's how, going back will help you move forward as well. Um,
I love that response in the details there, because I think sometimes we do forget that our produce has changed so dramatically, especially in the second half of the 20th century. But I won't go into that. We know the story there. I do
yeah.
have a follow-up question for any of you, really. So how different, and I want to think about different groups of people, different experiences. So how different were the food experiences of wealthy households, ordinary families, enslaved people, and indigenous communities? Does anyone want to talk about kind of some of just the variety of experiences that people had with food in this era?
Well, one of the things I would point out is also there was a difference between informal family eating and formal entertaining. So even if a family was upper class, they would eat, breakfast, for example, in a very different way from the way they would entertain. But that's really not your question. Your question is about the different, you know, groups of people and how they ate. And I can't really speak to that.
I can't really speak to it in specific either. It's not my area, but generally, what I would add to what Laura has said here is that the food on the table is always in a state of evolution. So if we go back to the beginnings of the Republic, everyone was struggling, right?
Mhm.
And there was a need to depend upon the environment, to depend upon each other, natives, right? There was a different philosophy about food and cooking and survival that um, really does start to fracture the more people feel a sense of superiority and elitism and distance from their home countries. And this becomes a way of separating by class. And So people feel like they can eat only certain things. Molasses, for example, is considered only sufficient sweetener for the enslaved. The peanuts that come from Africa with them are also considered animal fodder, and yet
Yeah.
Virginia, now is got a gourmet peanut industry, right? And so we can just see that these foods move around, the approach to them, the attitudes about them, who's cooking them from time to time period. They just continue to evolve. But I like to think that in those earliest days, there was a lot more balance and equity in the food,
Yeah, I mean,
even amongst those that were in servitude.
mhm. I definitely feel that thread in my own research, Tony. I've looked at street food history in the United States or in North America broadly conceived. And New Orleans is my area of expertise. And when you look at what was going on in the streets of New Orleans in the 1770s,
Right.
1780s, you're seeing enslaved African women who would be selling, or African women and their descendants who would be selling gumbo right there on the streets. And this was a food that was eaten by everyone. So I was kind of shocked as I learned more and more about street food culture that there is, I'm not going to call it equity, but kind of regardless of someone's class status or racial identity at the time, you might give a few cents or whatnot to a food vendor and enjoy a bowl of gumbo right there on the street, or some sugary fried rice fritters like kala or something like that. There was formal dining, as Laura said, but there's also this beautiful informal dining outdoors in public spaces that is street food culture. And that's not unique to New Orleans or even North America. You're seeing that in
Right.
places across the globe at this time. So I often kind of think of street food as this great equalizer, but in the sense that it gives us insight into many people's experiences, not that it was, changing any major power dynamics by just consuming the food itself. But
Yeah.
I had mentioned there that Laura and I were kind of on the same page, and my next question is tailored specifically to Laura's research interests and expertise. So, Laura, I'm curious to know, what can Alexander Hamilton's world of dining and entertaining, which of course includes the world of his colleagues, tell us about the role of food and hospitality, and what role food and hospitality played in politics and social influence during the founding era?
Well, first of all, I was very surprised to find out that dining rooms didn't exist until after the Revolutionary War. They were became a fashion. But before then, people ate wherever there was a big open space. And for example, in the summer, that might be in the Schuyler family, which was where Alexander Hamilton's wife came from in upstate New York. They might have eaten in like a central hallway, I mean, in the summer. But in the winter and in colder months, they would eat in a parlor room. But there was no such thing as a dining room. And there is, I mean, I hesitate to call myself a historian because I feel like I'm just a lawyer, as my kids would have said. So, but the Hamilton story is one of kind of, well, and you can hear the a modern day plane flying overhead. Sorry. Um, there's that song, The Room Where It Happened. Well, that room was in James Madison's and Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton's experience, a dinner of just three men in Thomas Jefferson's home. It was created by a slave who was Sally Hemings' brother, James, and it was a gourmet meal. Why were they eating in Thomas Jefferson's home? Well, in one respect, they were eating there because restaurants, by and large, weren't a thing. Restaurants are such a big thing these days, but there were no restaurants then, or there were very few restaurants, and there certainly weren't restaurants where women went. I mean, that's another thing. That's another whole story. The role of women and, how women were cooking but not eating, or cooking and entertaining but always in the background. So the room where it happened was really, it was a political compromise. It was the Compromise of 1790. It was what brought Washington, D.C., where I live, to be the nation's capital. And it created the financial system, which was Hamilton's desire, in exchange for putting the capital in the South. Well, why is food important? Food was important because they had this big, luxurious, multi-course meal where they talked. It was really about kind of old-fashioned conversation and taking a long time to eat. I mean, these days, have you ever gotten one of those notes from a restaurant that says, "We're holding your table, but only for 75 or 90 minutes or whatever." And, after that, you need to get up because we need to let in the next group of people. Well, food wasn't like that. Entertaining wasn't like that. It was a long, you know, the meal was long. There was lots of time for a political conversation.
Mm. And speaking of these gorgeous kind of spreads created by enslaved people like James Hemings and others, I want to actually talk a little bit about how food was made in this era. What were the spaces? Who were the people? What was the kitchen equipment? Where was the food coming from? I'm throwing this out to all three of you to think about, and whoever wants to chime in, like I'd love to just know, yeah, how did food get made in the 1770s, 1780s?
I would love to address that one because I just spent earlier this year, I did a trip to Newtown, Pennsylvania, and I cooked I learned open hearth cooking at the Half Moon Inn, and it's one of the historical inns that actually survived the war. It was built in 1725, and I went there as part of the training for the um, Nathaniel Russell House, and because the kitchen they used an open hearth, right? And it quite of an experience. Okay, so there's one thing to take the recipe, and then there's another thing to get the archaeological evidence of what they cooked. Like, okay, there's sesame, there's okra, there's peanuts. There's another thing to learn how to start a fire and to work that. Okay. I was really pleased when you said it was quite a process and a dining experience because you had to start the fire, right? And then you had to get it to the right temperature. And the hearth that I cooked on was, I believe, 5 feet high and about 8 feet wide. I mean, literally can get in it. And at its hottest point in the middle was like 1200 degrees. So you had to learn how, like if you're baking on it, which I learned how to bake in it, you had to, move your dough, and it was just quite this experience. But all of that to say, I mean, you really had to understand the technology of the fire in the process. What blew me away was the amount of smoke. It didn't matter where you are in the building. And the fact that these are women, also often, at least in my studies, I know same for Toni, enslaved women in long gowns, petticoats, long sleeves. And I wasn't dressed anywhere like that. And I had to like sit, I was seeing stars. I mean, new respect, right? Um, so I think the cooking process and the hearth was a big deal. Yeah.
Oh, I think that's such a wonderful introduction to the discussion. Thanks for asking that question, Ashley. By coincidence, this happens to be the pivot point for the next phase of my work. So I'm going to take a point of privilege and brag about that for a minute. But I'll first piggyback on what Robin has said here, in that in the Jemima Code, it was important to just identify that these people existed and to describe very much what she just explained is this: what is the environment in which they're trying to conduct their work in this massive heart where there's a fire hazard and there are children running around. I jokingly said that none of us would want our children running around on a gas stove, much less,
Right.
in a 7 foot um, uh, open flame with wrought iron pots that, weigh 30 pounds once
Mhm.
they're filled with whatever is being prepared there. But a lot of the conversation back to that point and Jubilee was very basic, my basic understanding and what the literature exposed, which was that you cooked in a hearth and that you used a Dutch oven to bake breads and things on the lid under coals, or you stuck the sweet potato inside the ashes in order to steam it. And so there's the over flame cooking. But one of the things that has been so provocative for me to learn about is the idea of the oven itself, and the fact that there were ovens built into the walls in the homes of the elite, um, that were attached to the hearth. And it was a contraption that allowed the heat to migrate out of the hearth and into what we now know as a more dry heat environment space. And you can still see them in several places. Monticello unearthed one, which was what changed the focus for my next book. I signed a contract with Potter um, during COVID to write a book on Jubilee baking. But the more that I researched this idea of how we get sweets and desserts into the American canon, it has become obvious that dessert making in itself is an incredible skill that integrates this. In some places, it's called the Rumford oven. I think in Hamilton Hall in Salem, Massachusetts, they call it the Rumford oven. But it's basically two holes in the wall. And it requires people to have an understanding of technique as well as the essential knowledge of just how to measure the heat. So, what I'm saying is that my work has evolved too, right? When I started, I thought that that was really profound. But when I started to study and understand that um, cooks like Eliza Seymour Lee, who trained and apprenticed other um, uh, cooks in the late 1700s, early 1800s, these are people that are now practicing European technique when they're baking. They're not just making hardtack and pounding biscuits. They're making, when we look at Jefferson's table, or um, the environment where George Washington's dinner that Laura was talking about in Francis Tavern in New York, they're using techniques that we think of for fine dining, fancy desserts, creme brulee, custards, and lots of really fancy things. And so the topic of my new book, I'll wrap, is Jubilee Desserts with a French Twist from the cookbooks. And it's been really eye-opening to discover how much knowledge these individuals had that we have completely ignored.
That's a fantastic. Oh, I'm excited for this project. Another book to add to my shelf. I have a whole section dedicated to Tony's work. I'm so excited by that. And it reminds me of some research I did very, very early on in my graduate career, where I was looking at colonial Saint-Domingue in the area of what we know as Haiti today. And some of the
Mhm.
most skilled enslaved people were confectioners, and some of them were trained in Europe, and by their enslavers, sending them to Europe to get this certain knowledge and coming back. And they were the most revered artisans. Even though they were enslaved, they were very highly, highly coveted and prized as artisans and workers of their craft, which is just, you see that even in New Orleans as well and throughout the South. And again, it's honoring the artistry and celebrating the creativity. So I'm always like loving to read Tony's works.
Well,
So
can I just jump back in there with you to say that, not only are they trained in the French manner, but they're also dealing with temperamental ingredients, right? We just think of flour as flour,
Right.
but the way that a flour might be milled in one time of year, in one location, can create all kinds of peculiarities in the way that a recipe would turn out. And so part of the reason I think that the historical record portrays the cooks as unintelligent is because their answers were not in a scientific manner. They weren't able to explain the temperamental nature of the grain. They would just say, I use more if I need to, or I use less if I don't. Like that's somebody
Right.
who's in command of their kitchen and their ingredients. But a person who's trying to capture that recipe or record it needs more details than that. And so that knowledge, the only way we know about that knowledge is from the sales receipts, the advertisements, as you point out, Ashley, the various ways that these people were sought out from their home countries, and brought here because they had expertise in that cooking, and had been doing it for generations.
Mhm. Absolutely. And so we've had a bit of time here to explore what's going on around the hearth and in these kitchens. And I wanted to go back to a point that Tony had mentioned earlier about how sometimes we overlook how food is distributed within the colonial world in the early American Republic. And that's actually a topic that's near and dear to my heart, as I've spent far too much of my life, half of my life, studying kind of the distribution networks of New Orleans, but other places in the country. And I think what people will find surprising is that, we think of the agricultural South from a bird's eye view, and we see these large scale plantation economies. We're looking at enslavers who are running those economies, and we see the transatlantic trade, right? But I say, let's zoom in closer. Let's go down on the ground and actually see how is a city like New Orleans, who in this period is kind of toying around with sugarcane plantations and whatnot, but how are the people actually feeding themselves? How does a city like New Orleans fuel itself, in spite of or despite all of the plantation, large scale economy happening around the city? And that's where street food comes in. And that's where public markets come in. Because in New Orleans in 1776, it was under the colonial rule of Spain. Many people don't realize that New Orleans was under Spanish rule just as long as it was under French rule. And it was the Spanish who actually said, this is kind of a backwater city that is totally out of control. We need to regulate food distribution. So they're the first ones to actually establish a municipally regulated public market in the center square. This is where the whole town legally has to come to purchase their food because the Spanish made it illegal to purchase your food elsewhere. But what I find most interesting is that it was enslaved people who were the primary vendors in these spaces. They were often assigned these roles by their enslavers. But there was an interesting loophole in the Code Noir, or the Black Code, that kind of regulated how enslaved people were treated by enslavers. There was a loophole that said enslaved people could actually accrue money. They could accrue profits. And there was a culture in New Orleans that was set by enslavers where they actually had the individuals, the enslaved people manning stalls in the marketplace. They allowed them to accrue profits from each sale that they made on behalf of the enslaver. So, surplus produce from those surrounding plantations. And also, enslaved people had the opportunity, if their enslaver allowed it, to sell their own surplus goods in the marketplace on Sundays. So each enslaved person in New Orleans was often allotted a small garden plot, and their enslaver expected them to grow enough produce to sustain themselves, but anything extra could potentially be sold to the broader New Orleans population. And the profits from that could be accrued and held by the enslaved vendor. And so there are examples over time where an enslaved vendor, you know, bushel by bushel, praline by praline, over decades accrued enough funds to purchase their own freedom, or the freedom of a family member or more than one family member. This was not necessarily the outcome for most people, but there are a fair few examples of enslaved vendors finding freedom, creating freedom through this way. And so when I talk about kind of public trade networks and how food moved around, enslaved people were at the center of that. And not only were they the vendors, they were often most of the customers, whether they were purchasing items for themselves, but more often on behalf of their enslavers. So you have this very dynamic local economy where the main players who are setting prices, negotiating prices, accruing profits are enslaved people. But that's often overlooked when you have that bird's eye view of the large scale plantation economy. So in my book, Nourishing Networks, it's saying, hey, let's shift the focus here, and we get a slightly different story. It's not that enslaved people had an incredible amount of power. Enslavers wouldn't have allowed that in enslaved society in New Orleans, but they did have some power, to the point where you had elite people kind of complaining in the local newspapers about how much control enslaved people had in the public markets. So I offer that as just a little segue or a sidetrack into my work, but I want to bring things back to Toni, and some of her work as well. So here's the kind of larger question. And as I was just mentioning, certain stories go untold. Certain stories don't have a lot of evidence in the archival record. And this brings up the question of, who gets remembered? So, Toni, much of what we know about early American food does come from published cookbooks. But how does access to publishing shape whose culinary contributions are remembered and whose are largely overlooked?
Oh, well, that's a really short, quick answer. I think we all know the answer to that. My work would not exist if it weren't true that access to publishing is limited, and certainly representation of people of color has largely focused on enslaved populations. And so if I could tie this question back to your research, Ashley, and the idea of the vendors, here's an example of who gets to tell the story, how they tell it, and how it shapes our perception of people. Before you and I started doing a lot of this work, you've been referring to them as vendors today. But most of the record refer to them as hucksters, which is a disparaging term. It implies that someone has just been out there pestering you, or like whatever your perception of huckster is. It doesn't portray the person as an entrepreneur, right? And this is completely evident in the cookbooks that were published in the 20s and the 30s, on the dawn of the Jim Crow era, where the South was trying to reorganize itself and recover from the losses of war, and was really doing a lot of work to elevate the people on the ground and minimize the contributions of the Africans descendants that had been in their midst, that, as I said at the beginning, they had a different kind of relationship early on. And so what you find in some of these books from the 20s and particularly the 30s are lots and lots of references to these huckster, vendor, hawker people, in street people. And they're capturing their street cries, because the way that people get your attention in order to sell their wares is they would cry out, they would call out, they had rhymes, and it's very sing-songy sales pitches that you can listen to at the Library of Congress, where Ashley is now. They're fascinating to hear. And some of these cookbooks, right, like 200 Years of Charleston Cooking or the Savannah Cookbook, the Low Country, it has a similar port environment to New Orleans. And as a result, they share some of this vendor behavior. And so they treat these people as if they're almost like little pets in the public square. But the more research gets done in looking back at the point of origin for the African enslaved descendants, is to understand where they came from. And we know there's a break in how they lived at home and how they lived at their point of destination, but there are memories and experiences that they retained. And one of those is, unlike European women, African women had an understanding and a practice of political and economic life in the public square. So they were used to selling products and their wares. We can see that in just the headdresses that they wear in the islands, and they've got fruits and vegetables on their trays, on their heads. This is a part of their inheritance that they bring with them to port cities. So I wanted to just make that comment to transition into how that looks in a cookbook. And cookbooks, I think we have to first level set when we're talking about cookbooks and think also about them the way we think about the table and the food, in terms of who they're published for and who is publishing them. And again, as my work has become more granular, this time I'm actually looking very carefully at what those cookbooks like Dixie Dishes or 200 Years of Charleston Cooking, or even as far back as Amelia Simmons and the first American cookbook published in 1796. When we look at what those people were publishing and who it was for, there is a practice of borrowing, and we call it lots of things, but it's also considered appropriation, depending on who the recipes are being taken from. And when you look at Amelia Simmons' work, she basically writes a cookbook that is a reproduction of a European cookbook, but she introduces American indigenous ingredients to Americanize those recipes. And that is the basis of how we get a cookbook today and how we tell stories. We continue to take what was a recipe or a story or a practice or an industry, and we evolve it according to whoever the author is and whoever she might be consulting for her information or for her ingredients. And so it's been important to me to look beyond cookbooks. Cookbooks are useful to me because they allow me to provide balance from the African American perspective to what is being said in the literature or in white mainstream books. But it's important to have so many other types of documentation besides cookbooks. We have to look at the sales receipts. We look at the plantation owners' household journals. We have to look at ledgers. We have to look at farm documents and purchasing agreements. There are so many complicated ways to build so many ways to build out this complicated story, so that cookbooks alone are not the source. Because for too many years now, we have allowed the single voice of those that had access to publishing to be the only representation of the American food story. And we know, lastly, I'll wrap on this, that, let's just say in the 1730s, there were free Black caterers. So you're talking about the enslaved vendors. Well, there were free people who also immigrated here from Haiti, from Santo Domingo, from what we now know as the Dominican Republic. And they came with culinary backgrounds. And so in Rhode Island in the 1730s, we have celebrated cake bakers. In New Jersey in 1791, we have a man named Cyrus Bostille, who was employed in the Continental Army, but then he opened a baking shop. We have James Hemings, who we know about, who was trained in France, and there are at least 4 recipes of his recorded, 3 or 4, in his own handwriting. And we know that he and others like him trained the next generation. So we get ice cream, we get pralines, we get all of these French-inspired foods integrated and embedded in the American system, but we don't acknowledge their point of origin, as was true for Amelia Simmons and all of those authors that came behind her.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Toni, for taking time to kind of map that out for us and really understand these relationships. And what I like too about the examples you were giving is they're up and down the colonies at that time, or the early American states. This isn't just one place that you're drawing on. You're saying there's parallels in each of these places. There's a baking culture that is transatlantic, if not global at this time. And it's a diverse group of people who are in conversation and partaking in and shaping that culture, which is fantastic. And so we've had this wonderful conversation today. There were a few other questions that I was hoping to get to, but I think the richness of our responses so far has been fantastic. And I want to give our audience, our attendees here, a chance to ask questions, and whether it's for a specific person or just kind of a broader question for the group here. But I would love to hear from you. And I'm not sure if we just want to have people unmute and ask their question, or if you feel more comfortable typing it in the chat, I can also communicate that. But yes, put your thinking caps on, or maybe take them off and start sharing what you've been pondering the past 40 minutes or so.
Abby has a question.
Hi. So lovely to be on. And Toni, I am friends with Martin Draylock, who does Black Pot Supper Club. So this is like a treat to see you. My question is related to the last question about publishing and recipes. You've all spoken to like the African American and slave experience, but is there anything or a book recommended about the native experience here, about our native ingredients? Because obviously I don't know about language or their ability to record things similarly.
Well, I would say that the place to start would be with Sean Sherman's work. I have, and with Uh, sorry, I'm looking up. I cannot remember her name. I bet Ashley, you can remember. There are other Native American scholars, um, but with so they have even less um, other content to research than African Americans do. So it really is going to take someone from within that community to be able to guide um, your research. I will let others answer while I look and get this other book. Hold on.
Yeah, I think something else I wanted to add, one of the books that was helpful to me when I was doing research on New Orleans is one by David Usner, Usner, which is called Indian Settlers and Slaves in a Frontier Exchange Economy. He works with archaeologists. He draws on the archaeological record to understand what people were consuming prior to European arrival and European colonization. And you start to get a sense of these vast shell middens, for example, in New Orleans, these mounds or mountains of oyster shells, kind of demonstrating what local ingredients that indigenous communities like the Choctaw had been drawing on for millennia. But the archaeological record can certainly help with that. And Robin, I don't know if you have other works that you would kind of share out with Abby to kind of help her with her research or her interest.
I think the only thing that I could add is when I was just at the SAA conference, the Society of American Archaeologists, they had a lot of university presses there and agents, and I believe, there were ones there specifically, working with the western part of the country and Native American and even Hawaiian natives. I want to say University of New Mexico. Also, there was somebody there representing Alaska. There were so many people, and I was kind of just overwhelmed. So I'm sorry I can't give you a specific, like, go to University of New Mexico. I'm pretty sure that was one. I think University of Utah was another press, but I would just look at university presses and then see their works, and they seem to be pretty open to questions. I feel like if you reached out to someone, that you would get an answer,
Very cool.
a
I
response.
came up with those two books, by the way. So one of them is The Foods of the Southwest Indian Nation by Lois Ellen Frank. That's a more recently published book, and it's a Beard winner. But I have this old book from 1973, which is called Indian Cookin'. I have no idea whether you'll be able to find it anywhere. But it's called that's the cover of it is Indian Cooking, and then the title page is Indian Recipes. Thank the Lord of Harvest. Bless the work of our hands. And it's written by a woman who has dedicated the work to her mother as a celebration of pride in her heritage, both Indian and white. So, you might enter this title into a browser and see if any universities have digitized it or a version, something like it. Because I picked this up at one of my used bookstore situations.
That's awesome. What a treasure.
I
Thank
love
you.
that. And I'd also suggest for New Orleans, Shannon Lee Dawdy's work, Dawdy. She has some fantastic histories, again, using archaeology for Louisiana and Gulf Coast people. And she kind of talks about how indigenous communities were the central communities, even in the early decades or many decades of European colonization, because Europeans in the Gulf Coast could not survive on their own without the assistance of indigenous communities and also of the culinary and agricultural knowledge of the enslaved peoples that they forcibly brought with them as well. But she's a pretty spectacular scholar whose work is awesome. So I think we have another question in the chat that I'd love to bring up and kind of give a little bit of exchange between chat and in-person questions. So there's one about the ways that war can change economies, or rather, did the Revolutionary War cause a change in the distribution of food? And examples that were thrown out: tea, coffee, or just, how did things change after the war or during the war? Does anyone have some thoughts on that? Or Laura, did you see that at all in what Hamilton was sort of cooking, eating, writing about at the time?
Well, the one thing I would say is that, we think of boycotts as a modern phenomena, but they weren't. I mean, boycotting tea was a staple of the Revolutionary War period. And so, people learned to substitute ingredients. When Tony was talking about how ingredients weren't standardized, it made me think of how recipes have changed. And, that's a whole nother subject, but it's, one of the things is you should go back and look at the recipes in your family, and you'll see that your grandmothers and great grandmothers cook differently. They would just cook it till it's done or add more flour if you need it. Well, people these days don't want to deal with that. They want to know how much flour, what temperature to bake it at, when is it done? How will I know when it's done? Those are the questions, that people want to know.
Yeah,
I can
exactly.
add a little
Go
bit.
ahead, Robin.
Yeah, so I actually was just reading up on this in the last week or so that when there was a disruption with tea, for instance, folks still wanted the beverage, right? So they would just substitute and they would, if you were more rural, instead of getting that special imported tea from wherever that you can't get anymore, you would just, use what's in your yard. So mint, sassafras, that kind of thing, lavender. And actually I wanted to note that those things were also used for medicinal purposes as well, because you're not getting medicinal things. So, and then as far as coffee goes, that was the big introduction, if I'm correct, on chicory. And then the soldiers would roast grains and things to create like a malty beverage. So I thought that was interesting, adapting to get what you need.
I think it's interesting. You see the use of chicory, or the adoption of chicory during wartime, over and over and over again, because a military strategy straight off the bat is to shut down the ports of your enemy. Because once you shut
Right.
down trade networks, the army can't get supplies, and the army literally becomes weak due to malnutrition and starvation. But you see that in the Civil War. Chicory comes back as a popular beverage, because coffee isn't as available. You see that too, during World War One, during World War Two. Coffee is being sent abroad to fuel soldiers on the battlefield. So you see it time and time again. And in New Orleans, though, they're going to be drinking it, chicory and coffee, all the time. But
Right.
it is kind of a holdover,
I think
from
that's an
when ports were
interesting
closed.
observation, Ashley, that that's also how the foods of the lower classes move into the world of those who perceive themselves to be the upper classes. Because in times of war, everyone is struggling, and the
Right.
people that have been living in poverty and practicing survival cooking, there are lots of foods that we think of that again have evolved, right? They've been the food of the poor. Then when the broader society is surviving the rigors of war, then they adopt some of those foods, which is how we get the Southern cuisine. The canon for Southern cuisine basically is that many of those things that we think about as soul food at one time of our lives become just part of the Southern canon at
Mm.
another time in our lives. And so these foods cross boundaries, and we've only represented we've hidden, but represented at least the crossing from the slave cabin into the big house, but we have not yet spent much time talking about those skills and foods and techniques of adapting recipes from what one learns in the big house setting into your environment in your cabin. And so it's going to be a hard place to excavate, which is why Robin's work will be so important to help us find other sources that tell us what else was going on in those cabin
Right.
remnants.
Absolutely. And I do think we've seen throughout our conversation today this marriage of evidence that comes from the earth, that is archaeological, that sometimes is our refuse from cooking, but it holds so much information, not just about the ingredients, but also the climate. I mean, from certain seeds and things like that, you can get a sense of the weather patterns and what could grow or not grow at a certain time of year. And then we've drawn also to cookbooks and these formal published narratives, both that reveal insights into communities excluded from those spaces, but also for the people who did have access, trying to understand what they were trying to communicate within the cage of a larger sort of mainstream printing culture. And I think that's like a really important thread in Toni's work. And then with Laura, looking at the table, right? The politics of the table, things that were written in letters and manuscripts and other kinds of sources of how even our most important political decisions potentially took place around a shared meal. And its culinary diplomacy has been has played a central role in our country from the very beginning, and it still does to this day. And so I think bringing all of your areas of expertise together has been just fantastic, and honoring the different kinds of sources and non-written ones too. Like I mentioned, the archaeological sources, but oral histories and traditions that are passed down one kind of generation to the next through apprenticeship, formal and informal training. All of this comes together to paint a picture of what food looked like 250 years ago. And so now I will pass things back to Sheila, our wonderful host of today's program, and she will wrap things up for you.
Thank you, Ashley, and thank you to all of our speakers, Robin Griffith, Laura Kumin, Ashley Rose Young, and Toni Tipton Martin. Thank you for sharing your expertise and helping us better understand the many people who shaped American cuisine. Thank you also to ChefWorks for sponsoring this live online event, and to all of you for joining us. Penryn Craig, if you would just type your unanswered question in the chat, I will pass it to the speaker.
It's okay. It's okay.
Okay. I'd like to invite you all to continue the conversation with us later this summer as we shift from the history of American food to the history of the restaurant industry. On June 22nd, we'll present part 2 of our State of the Restaurant Industry series called The Restaurant Economy Today: Insights from Industry Analysts. The panel will feature Michelle Korsmo, the president and CEO of the National Restaurant Association, Alicia Kelso, executive editor of Nation's Restaurant News, Jonathan Mays, editor-in-chief of Restaurant Business, and Rich Shank, senior principal at Technomic. Together, they'll examine the economic forces, consumer trends, and business realities shaping restaurants in 2026. Then on July 28, we'll conclude the series with part 3, The Bigger Picture, leadership, culture, and the future of hospitalities. Dames Janet Curzon, Catherine Miller, Joanna James, and Jill Weber will explore how hospitality leaders are navigating issues of culture, workforce development, advocacy, storytelling, and social change. We hope you'll join us for both programs. Thank you again to those who are with us in real time today. We appreciate your engagement, your curiosity, and the meaningful connections that continue to strengthen our community of Dames across chapters, professions, and generations. We look forward to seeing you again at a future live online event. Goodbye for now.